Welcome. My name is Mohammed Jagana. I'm one of the marshals for the graduating class of 2022. And on behalf of the class marshals, I would like to welcome you to the first installment of the 2022 Last Lecture Series. So welcome. The Last Lecture Series presents an opportunity for select faculty members to provide guidance and to impart final words of wisdom on the graduating class. This week, we will hear from Professors Hanson and Molly Brady, and next week from Professors Nikolas Bowie and Stephanie Robinson. Before we begin, I would like to remind you that this lecture is being recorded and that there will be a Q&A session at the end of the lecture in case you have any follow-up questions for Professor Hanson, who's also agreed to stay behind for about 10 minutes or so to answer any questions. I would also like to note that food is on its way and will be here shortly. We're going to feed you, don't worry. And now it's my honor to introduce Professor Jon Hanson. Jon Hanson is the Alan A. Stone Professor of Law, the Executive Director of the Systemic Justice Project, and the co-founder and co-director of the Justice Initiative. Professor Hanson graduated from Yale Law School, clerked for Judge Jose A. Cabranes, spent 1 year as a postdoctoral fellow at Yale Law School, and before joining Harvard Law School as a faculty member. His teaching scholarship melds history, the mind sciences, economics, and law. Professor Hanson has received several teaching awards and is a faculty leader for 1L Section 6. Okay, Sixers, I see you. His recent scholarship includes the book Ideology, Psychology, and Law, and the Law Review article Occupy Justice, Introducing the Injustice Framework, forthcoming in the Harvard Law and Policy Review. Professor Hanson lives in Harvard, Massachusetts with his lovely wife, Kathleen, and they are proud parents of 3 grown children and a puppy, named Brady, who's phenomenal. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jon Hanson.
Thank you all very much. You can hear me okay? Really, really nice to be here. For my first last lecture and your first last lecture, a couple things. I want to thank Mohammed for organizing this and for his lovely introduction and for being just such a great spirit here these last couple years when I've gotten to know and work with you. To thank the class of 22 for selecting me as one of the people who you would be willing to hear from in this busy time of your life. And I also want to thank my best friend and beautiful wife, Kathleen, for joining us here today and for all of her support all the time, and for many of you in the room who have been supportive and encouraging along the way and who have provided a model for me about how to be better. And that's something I want to talk to us about today. So I'm going to get started on the last lecture. I mentioned to Kathleen yesterday that this might be somewhere between a last lecture and deathbed confessions. So we'll see. I'm confronted with the question, not what is your last lecture, but what would be my last lecture if I were giving the final one to my students or children. What would I want to be saying to them? It's based on the Randy Pausch last lecture when he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer at Carnegie Mellon. He gave a beautiful lecture, and his was entitled Really Achieving Your Childhood Dreams, and I thought I would take that as a bit of a starting point. What I want to talk about is recommitting to your childhood dreams of justice. And not saying that you've necessarily given up on them, but I am going to assume something about you which I understand to be a general phenomenon among graduating law students across the country. And I'm going to speak to that person today. So if I want to talk about dreams of justice, the first place I would start is your childhood dreams. In my opinion, children sort of get justice, and they have more clarity on those things than many of us adults do. I know that Kathleen and I became vegetarians because our then 7-year-old convinced us that we shouldn't be eating fish if they're the same fish that we saw at the aquarium, same in type, not necessarily the same identical ones, and it led to a longer discussion, which eventually led us to give up meet, which we did in 2000. And I feel like ultimately, though I pushed against it, she was right. And she didn't give up. If we think about the iconic examples of dreams of justice, it's hard not to think about Martin Luther King's very famous and iconic and culturally significant speech on having dreams, in essence, of justice, different ways to frame what he did and different uses of his speech. I want to be very careful in that, but I am going to use it just to say that I think what he was talking about largely was building, maintaining, and pursuing dreams of justice. He talked about that America has defaulted on its promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned, as a way of highlighting a profound injustice that was very salient at the time. Much of this should sound familiar to us today. But that they are there in the March on Washington in large part because they refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. They're calling upon that promissory note, and they expect that to be paid. And it's time to be paid now after a long delay, and the urgency of now in demanding justice is part of what he was talking about in this pursuit of dreams of justice. As he concluded his beautiful speech, he said, "We will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." By 1968, say 5 years later, King seemed a little less optimistic and was worried about the way in which the movement was unfolding. He spoke to his good friend Harry Belafonte, who recounted the conversation. He said, "I remember the last time we were together shortly before King was murdered. He seemed quite agitated and preoccupied, and I asked him what the problem was. And according to Belafonte, King replied, 'I've come upon something that disturbs me deeply. We have fought hard and long for integration, but I've come to believe that we are integrating into a burning house. The push for integration is not even close if the house itself is burning. That if the structures, the deeper structures are faulty or flawed or falling, it doesn't do a lot of good for us to fight to get in there. Until,' he wrote, 'the underclass is given justice, we will continue to perpetuate the anger and violence that tears the soul of this nation.'" This is consistent not just with his arguments about the importance of economic justice, and not simply racial justice, but the intersection of the two, but also the idea that it's not enough to help somebody or to have good intentions. You have to remake structures and systems. Please feel free to come up, even though I'm meandering up here. There's plenty of seats. I'm honored that you'd be here, and you should be comfortable for that price. When Belafonte asked, "Okay, but what should we do?" and what would be, in essence, King's last lecture to Belafonte, he replied, "Let us not stand by and let the house burn. We should be firefighters." And that sounds like, for those of you who'd like to burn it all down, that he's saying, no, don't do that. That isn't the way I understand this admonition. I think he's saying we have to address the structures, where the structures are the problem. And indeed, at that moment, the idea of the house burning was very salient, very evident, because that discussion had just followed upon 1967 summer, the long, hot summer, as it is known, in which there were, across urban areas around the country, as many as 158 different rebellions or uprisings or civic unrest or riots, as they were called by different people, that led to 83 deaths and 17,000 arrests. I'm going to show you a short video, about 2.5 minutes, that contains some of what was happening at the moment. Many of you are very familiar with this, and I apologize for sort of reproducing what you know, but some of you may not be as familiar with what was happening in 1967 that summer and the way in which it resembles your own lifetime.
During the summer of 1967, after years of growing racial tension, black neighborhoods in more than 150 cities erupted in protest, leading in some places to violent clashes with police and widespread destruction.
90 deaths, 2,000 injuries, 12,000 arrests.
In many cities, the unrest was sparked when black communities protested against abuse by mostly white police departments. Often, police and the National Guard responded with more force.
Mass arrests that swept up many innocent bystanders along with the lawbreakers. In the conflict between white authority and black ghetto, old grievances deepened and spread.
You cannot fight violent criminals with nonviolent methods. We had a war, and I think that you have to attack the war with warlike weapons and under warlike conditions.
What is responsible for this violence, for this rebellion, is the inability of the city government to feel, as human beings, the plights of the majority of the people in this city, and that is the cause of this violence.
As a result, President Lyndon Johnson formed a national commission led by Illinois Governor Otto Kerner to study why the uprisings happened and how they might be prevented in the future. The Kerner Commission's conclusions were stark. It pointed to decades of pent-up frustration in black communities over police brutality, poverty, and the inequality caused by discrimination and segregation. And the commission placed the blame for those inequalities squarely on white Americans and racism.
Our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Discrimination and segregation have long permeated much of American life. They now threaten the future of every American.
The Kerner Report called for sweeping changes to American society, more economic opportunity in black communities, better housing conditions, and more accountability for the police, including steps to stop police abuse, limit stop and frisk, and build trust between police and communities.
The Negro ghetto is a mystery to most police, except as a source of crime. But the commission suggested that police start looking at it as a place where people live.
It warned that failing to act would lead to more division and more unrest. The findings captured the public's attention, but Johnson, despite his work on civil rights, ignored them.
There's a whole story to tell about the reaction to the Kerner Commission report. I share it in part to suggest to you that you're not living in the first time of this kind of unrest, and that the kinds of arguments that you're hearing on different sides of our policy debates are also not new, and they have been with us for my whole life and for much longer than that. This report sort of takes this right up to today, and I want you to do that in your own mind. I don't think I need to do a lot of it, but I will come back to that in a few minutes. Part of what I want to do in suggesting also is that this was a pretty moderate group. Otto Kerner was the governor of Illinois, or had been, was looking to get a position in the judiciary. LBJ was hoping to leverage that desire on Kerner's part to have Kerner come out with a sort of a pro-LBJ report. It wasn't so pro-LBJ. It called upon the government to invest immensely in change and transformation at a moment when LBJ was feeling the budgetary pinches of his policies, including policies in Vietnam. And also, his previous policies were not given much credit for doing much to help this problem, which he would have liked about that time when reconsidering whether rerunning for president. Nonetheless, here was this moderate group saying things that are strikingly systemic and structural, in some ways speaking to what Martin Luther King was saying at the very same time. Segregation and poverty have created racial ghetto, a destructive environment, totally unknown to most white Americans, so really speaking to the racism problem, but also the structural environmental problems. White racism is essentially responsible for the explosive mixture which has been accumulating in our cities. Very explicit about where white racism stood here. And that what white Americans have never fully understood, but what black Americans can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated. That there is this connection, this connecting fabric that people like Martin Luther King spoke of, that implicates white society in which they are advantaged. by things like the ghetto, as it was described at the time. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it, reports Kerner and his commission. The atmosphere of hostility and cynicism, they wrote, is reinforced by a widespread belief among black Americans in the existence of police brutality and in a double standard of justice. So that justice wasn't real, the dreams of justice had not been realized, and it was important to try to solve this problem. And to solve it would require a major commitment to national action that involved compassion and sustained commitment from every American. It will require new attitudes, new understanding, and above all, new will. We propose these aims, the report went on, to fulfill our pledge, now seemingly speaking to King himself, in conversation with King about the promise unmet, to fulfill our pledge of equality and to meet the fundamental needs of a democratic and civilized society, domestic peace, and social justice. So a pledge to realize the justice dream. 1 month after the Kerner report would be what amounted to Martin Luther King's last lecture. He was, it seemed, prescient, in some way anticipating the threat he was under. And he spoke that evening about his mortality and admitted that he would like to live a long life, but not concerned about that now. In this speech, the mountaintop speech, he reminded his listeners to keep the issues where they are. The issue is injustice. We've got to keep our attention on that. We've got to give ourselves to this struggle until the end. And by the end, I assume that's when justice rolls down like waters. The following day, he was assassinated, and that would lead to hundreds more uprisings around the country. And it is in large part, though not solely, because of this collection of unfolding events in 1967 and 1968, and similar ones actually happening around the globe. The 1968 was seen by everyone, and still is, as a major pivot point in history. A turning point. It's the year that transformed the nation, the year that America unraveled, it changed America forever, the year that shattered America. It shaped a generation. It's a year to remember. It rocked Washington. Heck, it rocked the world. And in part because of that pivot point, when we look back, the Kerner report serves as a kind of high point. A high point of systemic, structural, justice-based thinking on the part of conventional governmental actors. As Stephen Gillen writes, the Kerner report represented the last gasp of 1960s liberalism, the last full-throated declaration that the federal government should play a leading role in solving deeply embedded problems such as racism and poverty. And that's when the dream began to fade. To borrow a word from Langston Hughes, that's when the dream was again deferred. And that is owing to a whole host of circumstances and factors, but one of which was a very deliberate backlash against justice, though it wasn't always framed that way. And those of you who know the history, and I'm sure by this point most of you do, you know the role of different laws and policies and institutions in shaping that. Some of the ones that come to mind, including changes in criminal legal policy, such as the war on drugs, police empowerment. It was in response, in part, to the Kerner report that police were able to justify unionization and therefore gain more power, and also flip the script about law and order, the Southern strategy, and on and on. What gets less attention, and perhaps it got less attention with you, is the role of changing power dynamics, and in particular, the empowerment of corporations and corporate interests, which is an interest of mine that I think is really, really important. Those of you in my corporations class have heard enough of this, but you're stuck with it. This happened in part because changing narratives that would follow 1968. And in the early 1970s, late 60s and early 70s, you see a transformation of legal theorizing. in response to this important moment. And among the key actors are some of the most influential jurists and legal scholars of their generation. Lewis Powell, Richard Posner, both Harvard Law grads, and Robert Bork are three key actors in this. And then there's a host of Nobel Memorial Prize winning economists who also contributed to this shifting narrative in their own and important ways. And as they did so, they pushed our attention from issues of justice. They collectively engaged in three tactics, or at least that's how I'm going to summarize it. These were not strangers, these men, and many of them in their autobiographies or based on biographies were really concerned and upset by the late 1960s and the egalitarian trends of that time period. And they tended to hang out in some of the same circles, including University of Chicago, Mont Pelerin Society, and other places. George Stigler and Richard Posner met each other at Stanford and became buddies there. There's this collection of individuals and ideas. And what each of them did in their own way was come up with a theory or a story that would discredit the norm of justice, that would substitute some alternative decision standard and process that we should use to supplant it when making policy or talking about laws, which is now you're feeling this getting closer to home, I hope, and that would have the effect of empowering corporations and disempowering other actors that might challenge corporate power. I won't take you through this in any detail, but just to give you a sample of it, when Friedrich von Hayek was writing in the late 1960s and ultimately publishing his first of three books in this trilogy in 1973, he wrote of justice as an empty formula, a mirage, and as meaningless. He urged his readers and explained to them, you've got to let justice go. You've got to suppress the feeling that certain differences of the world are unjust. We have to recognize, he wrote, that only a system where we tolerate grossly unjust differences of the world is capable of keeping the present populations of the world in existence. It's a pragmatic consideration. You've got to let those moral considerations go for the sake of people and their freedom. The society which is efficient, and here is the new norm that he's offering, and the new process is markets. Markets become the new process, the new norm is efficiency, and what we have to do is jettison notions of justice. The society which is efficient cannot be just, and unfortunately, a society which is not very efficient cannot maintain the present population of the world. So sorry, but we've got to let justice go. Milton Friedman, among his many writings that spoke to these same themes, wrote in 1970 about corporate law and what should be the obligation of corporate managers and directors. And the answer was it should not be social responsibility. Absolutely not, although some people spoke of that as if speaking about justice. It should instead be profits, increased profits. And he said that those who speak of social responsibility are just preaching pure and unadulterated socialism and are unwitting puppets of the intellectual forces that have been undermining the basis of a free society. So we see this justice in sort of conflict with freedom is one of the stories that all of these authors picks up. A corporate executive is an employee of the owners, he writes, and now gives us a new norm. He has direct responsibility to those owners and therefore should make as much money as possible. And that's the norm, if you studied corporate law, you know has become the dominant norm in corporate law. It wasn't before this. Those of you who studied antitrust law also know the influence of Robert Bork, although his influence would be found in constitutional law too, as he made the case for textualism and originalism, which now dominates. He was also writing about antitrust, writing that courts are enacting these unarticulated social values like justice. What do they even mean? He asks. What we need to do is focus on consumer welfare, and that means focusing on efficiency, which means turning it over to markets and measuring market actors not by their size. Let's not be so focused on their size. Let's ask if they're successful. In fact, size might be an indicator of success. The bigger you are, obviously, the better you are, is the presumption that he asks us to accept, and that becomes the norm in antitrust law around the same time period. And that doing otherwise, as the court had been doing, is moving away from the ideal of liberty and from rewarding according to merit towards some idea of equality of outcome and reward according to status. Give that and those notions up. Lewis Powell, at this same moment, is drafting the Powell Memorandum, which says to major corporate actors and potential corporate benefactors, hey, let's come together. Let's come together and work together to influence key institutions like the media, like universities, and law schools, and the judiciary. He wrote this for the Chamber of Commerce. It became hugely influential. He wrote in that memo, the overriding first need is for businessmen to recognize that the ultimate issue may be survival of free enterprise and all that this means for the strength and prosperity of America and freedom of our people. So again, we're hearing that same kind of story, and we have to come together. We have to have consistency of action, joint effort, and united action in national organizations. In other words, as we look at these stories, all of them are saying, we who are advantaged in our system need to stop responding to those who are empowering themselves by coming together and pointing out the injustices and calling upon us to achieve justice, to change our systems. We need to mobilize in the same way. We need to come together and we need to fight for our interests. And to do that, we're going to throw out conceptions of justice or social responsibility. And we're going to accept a notion of freedom behind ideas of markets and aversion for regulation. And that collection of ideas becomes dominant, and each one of those stories helps empower corporations. And in doing so, allows them to better capture other institutions. Milton Friedman. One single goal you should have, shareholder primacy, think of nothing else. That maximizes your profit, it allows you to disregard the harms you're causing to other stakeholders, and gives you the same common interest as every single other large corporation, so that now when you're in the political contest, you're working together with a single shared interest. Extremely powerful. Bork says, I can do you one better. I can bring a lot of those corporations into a single corporation and allow mergers within industries where we would otherwise be worried about the power that would manifest through them from those large industries on labor, on the community, on the environment, on politicians. Put that aside, if it's bigger, it's better. Powell says, I can go one higher. Take what we've got, however big it is, however wealthy and powerful it is, let's come together and understand we have shared interests. At the same time, there was non-corporate disempowerment. George Stigler wrote about corporations' influence over regulation, more or less reproducing the argument I just made. I'm just giving you Stigler. But what Stigler did with his argument is say, we have to worry about corporate capture, and the way we do that is deregulate, which is a striking policy conclusion to reach when the problem is corporate actors have disproportionate power to influence other institutions because they have a shared, common, large, significant interest and a lot of wealth to spend on it. In that sense, I say he captured the notion of capture. Richard Posner, in 1973, he published his first edition of Economic Analysis of Law. I don't need to tell you what that did, but it's the same basic story. We need a different standard. Common law is and ought to be efficient as measured by willingness to pay. Who does that advantage? Those with the greatest ability to pay, typically. And this becomes the theory that would help undermine the common law as a potential regulatory institution. It's the foundation of things like tort reform. It becomes the intellectual basis of the tort reform movement, for example. And these theories together, by individualizing other stakeholders, except for corporations, which have just come together and powered together through these different stories, makes of everyone else individuals who are competing with each other, divides them and asks them and forces them to compete and calls that freedom, and tells us to put aside our concerns of justice. And they told stories that each in their own way hid history and erased the inequalities or the power asymmetries of the parties, the larger context, the distribution, The systems, the structures, the institutions, the biases, the group-based dynamics of power and injustice that were operating, all of those disappear. We're talking about two people deciding whether to contract or not. What's willingness to pay? What's willingness to accept? Nothing else matters. That's what markets give us. They erase injustice. And in process, they empower and unite the haves and disempower and disunite the have-nots. I didn't say my last lecture was going to be happy. This is what I think has happened to our system. 50 years later, we enter your world, the world where, again, I don't need to tell you about the situation. We can see injustice unfolding. We can see how something like a pandemic can land intersectionally, can reproduce intersectional harms and inequalities. And we can see how the stories that are told, often to justify the policies that have led to these problems, are themselves echoes of the stories that were being told beginning in the 1970s. That's our legacy to you. Very clear that the house is still burning. And among the structures and institutions that are contributing to that, law is Exhibit A, and legal theory as well. It's in part because of the injustice and the saliency of the injustice that so many of you came to law school. You wanted to do something. You had a justice dream. And you came with dreams of justice. And you thought that the law might be a place that might provide that justice, might be a source of your achieving justice. And that's in part because there was in law a promise of justice. It's there in legal education too. In the basic story that is typically understood or often projected to the world about what law and legal education are, is it looks something like this. You take justice-oriented students, like many of you, and they go to law school. Because if you like justice, you think law would be the place to pursue it, so you come to law school. We're going to teach you what to do, and we teach you what to do, and we send you out into the legal profession. You become the personnel of the legal profession. The higher you go according to legal profession standards, the more likely you are to show up on the law school websites. The legal profession then shapes through the ideas and narratives that we have taught you here, law and policy itself in the institutions. You're the personnel that then create the laws and policies and then help facilitate the norms and systems that are operating. And all of that ultimately leads to justice. That's the end point. This is the justice dream realized according to the traditional story. And therefore, because of that, the thought is more justice-oriented students come to law school because they know this is the place to get there. The problem with that story is it's not true. And it's worse than that. Law school and legal education generally is engaged in what I think can fairly be described as a bait and switch, a kind of fraud. And it works kind of like any bait and switch. The traditional definition of unlawful bait and switch applies to insincere offers to sell one item in order to induce the buyer to purchase another. Promising to provide one thing to induce the buyer to purchase another. Promising to provide justice to induce others to accept unjust but legal outcomes. Might be the way you would frame this bait and switch. Let me provide some more of that story. The law needs to sell justice, like McDonald's needs to serve burgers. The legitimacy of the legal system depends upon it being perceived as just. And when, say, the founders were setting up this system, they fully understood that. Both there had been lots of writing and thinking about how you need to have a legitimate system to justify state power, on one hand. And think about it, these founders had just witnessed and participated in a revolution throwing off a government on the ground that it was in Jefferson's terms, a tyrant, an unjust tyrant. And now you're the same people telling us you're going to set up a government? You better have a good reason. Answer, we do. We need to come together, and we can assure you we'll be fine because we are putting justice first. You should accept more or less this social contract that we're entering because justice is key. As Madison put it in Federalist 51, justice is the end of government. It's the end of civil society. It ever has been, ever will be pursued until it be obtained or until liberty be lost in the pursuit. The preamble, we the people of the United States in order to form a more perfect union and establish justice, etc. Those who would push back and call upon the law and the system to be true to its values would also point to justice. Frederick Douglass, where justice is denied and any one class is made to feel that society is an organized conspiracy to oppress, neither persons nor property will be safe. People are not obliged to abide by those laws. And we know this is also what's informing Martin Luther King's justice dreams and the unwillingness to be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters. And we all know this. Any of us who participated in a protest, we're not going along if it's unjust. The system depends on justice, and we in the legal system also know that's true. Law must be about justice to be legitimate, says Martha Minow. Central to any scheme of legal justification is justice. And Judge Learned Hand, Harvard Law grad, if we're to keep our democracy, there must be our one commandment, thou shalt not ration justice. They're saying the same thing, and it's because of that need for justice that the legal system sells justice. And so they offer the bait. And the bait is all over the system. We decorate with justice. Everything of significance in our system that has a great deal of power, we throw the label justice on it. Highest echelons of our judiciary are always known as justices. On all of our courthouses, or most of them anyway, central is this notion of justice. Here, if you go to Boston, the Moakley Courthouse, you know well the various inscriptions around in granite that are more or less pushing this notion that this building is devoted to justice. You can go to the Suffolk County Courthouse, and over their door is also the same story. Law schools, same story. As Robin West put it, justice is carved into buildings on legal campuses as the end, and justice is, of course, widely held on commencement, law day, and Constitution Day speeches as point of the legal enterprise. This is not technically a commencement speech, in my opinion, just so this is not. You look around Harvard Law School, you'll see plenty of evidence of that. Who knows what that says? But among the things that are written around and inscribed around Langdale are, for we cherish justice and profess knowledge of what is equitable and just. Judge the poor and fatherless, do justice to the afflicted and needy. The mission of Harvard Law School is to educate leaders who contribute to the advancement of justice. And of course, the new seal says it very clearly. Harvard Law School stands for truth, law, and justice. Harvard's not alone. This is not a critique of Harvard. This is legal education generally, of which Harvard is a key example. But you can do the ABCs of law school. So you go to Albany Law School. What's their mission? Our students develop a deep commitment to justice and ethical values. Barry University for your B, a quality legal education that leads to informed action and a commitment to social justice. You want to C, Cleveland Marshall College of Law, learn law, live justice. People see that. McDonald's has hamburgers. Legal system has justice. And so we take the bait. Young people hoping to advance justice attend law school, often taking huge debt and competing with others to get a position here. And yet those commentators and social scientists who have looked will also say that's exactly true. So many of you come to Harvard Law School or to law school generally in pursuit of justice. Duncan Kennedy said it in 1983. Robert Granfield, a sociologist who did a study at Harvard Law School, that took several years, explained both the statistical data and in-depth interview data provide strong evidence that large numbers of students attended for altruistic reasons. The ABA report in 1994 said the concern for social justice and service to humanity was the most important of all the reasons given. Sam Moyne in 2018 wrote about students hoping to advance or even incarnate certain ideals of political and social justice. And then if you look at your own answers to surveys I run for purposes of teaching, not for purposes of this typically, you'll see that I came to law school and I want to work on solving pressing problems. 90% agree. 98% agree that you hope your experience, this is your first day of law school, you're filling this out. Education will help you better understand the causes of major problems. And in value statements, I ask students to fill out in the first day of class, you hear the justice dreams. These are your messages to yourselves, written as 1Ls, to be read at graduation. But you've come to Harvard Law School now, or legal education, and there's been a switch. Something happens. This too has been commented on immensely. All you have to do is do a little Westlaw searching and you will find author after author who captures this essence. Angela Harris, justice is the reason why many of my students have come to law school, but justice is not what the law provides. Elizabeth Mertz, an anthropologist who studied this very issue, talks about law school teaching an implicit lesson that questions of justice are peripheral to the central business of law. We don't say that over our doors. The Carnegie report in 2007 says issues such as the social needs or matters of justice involved in cases do get attention in some case dialogue classrooms, absolutely, but these issues are almost always treated as addenda. In their all-consuming first year, students are told to set aside their desire for justice. That thing that brought you, that justice dream, set it aside. There's legal analysis to be done and law to be learned. Bill Quigley writes, the actual message from law school is that justice work, if done at all, is done in the margins or after the real legal work is done. Dean Jane Aiken writes, typical law school classes have the effect of teaching students they have little power to affect justice in society. Robin West, justice is simply not a subject of study in the legal academy. Not part of legal scholarship, it's not taught, studied, or much discussed in American law schools. It's like going to McDonald's and finding out they don't have hamburgers. Legalism is so encompassing a worldview that it crowds out the law student's or scholar's inquiry regarding the goodness or lack of goodness or the justice or injustice of a law. It crowds out worries over whether an entire swath of law or an entire legal system is just or unjust. It crowds out the question, is the house burning? That question we don't talk about in law school. It's about laws and legalism and rules. Justice is out of bounds. When you listen to the people who are doing some of the more impressive work and sort of changing narratives and having us rethink our legal system and how it operates, they will tell you, these are lawyers who will tell you, it's not because of law school, it's despite law school. Law school is a place, says Michelle Alexander, where you learn the rules of the game and how to play it, but it isn't a place where people think deeply about justice. Brian Stevenson, the courses seemed esoteric and disconnected from the race and poverty issues that had motivated me to consider the law in the first place. Most recently, Derricka Purnell, in her book, Becoming Abolitionist, describes her experience at orientation when justice is still on the table, the dean welcoming the class by saying that Harvard was not simply a law school but a justice school. but then describing her own disappointment when she discovered that she didn't find any justice in the hundreds of pages that she read each night for class, nor was it any part of any lectures that she attended. On top of that, when you go to ask, can I get a hamburger? They're like, what are you thinking? That's silly. This place is not for justice. Angela Harris describes how disoriented, unsure of ourselves a few of us felt, that something was profoundly missing in our education, that we couldn't articulate what it was. Duncan Kennedy describes the hot case, where he explains that the basic message of teaching certain cases is to tell the student, maybe you aren't cut out to be a lawyer if you can't put aside those concerns about justice. Robert Granfield talks about how students' conception of what constitutes justice, social activism, and public interest changes during law school, so that their dreams of justice come to be seen as unprofessional and immature. And they had to tame them. And in the process, they tamed people's commitment to making real change. Developing a professional identity, he writes, meant defining non-legal views of justice and social activism as naive and immature. Martha Minow writes, somehow law school quickly gives the message that law is not about justice, that the justice is for the sentimental, the immature, or in any case, not for lawyers. Elizabeth Mertz talks about how this can be disorienting, and you somehow wonder if you've lost touch with what brought you to law school. Your justice dreams and what's happened to them in law school, well, if you ask law students, at least in my corporate law class, which is not a random sample, this is not scientific, only 24% agree that the law and legal system on the whole does a good job of addressing injustices and promoting justice. More than half agree that the legal system is on the whole an important cause of our most pressing intersystemic policy problems and injustices. 60% agree that the legal system is on the whole a tool with which the powerful and the wealthy maintain and enhance their advantage. And if you look at this scale where the question is indicating whether you believe our laws and legal systems serve more as an instrument of power, that would be a 0, or as an instrument of justice, that would be a full 10, where mean is 2.9. Heavily skewed towards power, not justice. Only 4% of you agree with the statement that the general curriculum in law school trains well most students how to understand and to solve these sorts of problems. This matters. As Robin West says, this presentation and performance of justice in public, but the private truth of ignoring justice in private, in these spaces behind the curtain, is pathological. And what it does is it promises to provide justice in part to bring you here, those who care about justice. And what do we give you? We give you law and legalism. And we send you into the world to be lawyers, operating within the systems, using the kinds of theories that are meant to erase justice as a consideration. And we enlist you to participate in selling the idea to the public that our systems are just. We are all simultaneously victims of the bait and switch and perpetuators of it. And even if it's not true of you individually, as Bill Quigley says, a shamefully large part of our profession, in fact, consists of the opposite of justice, exploitation of the weak by the strong. Purvi Shaw says the reality is that the vast majority of our profession sits on the sidelines of social change. Only 3% of Americans, 1.3 million lawyers, work on issues of justice and poverty. This shouldn't be okay. It's normalized, it's the way it is, it happens generation after generation, but it shouldn't be okay. I'm not going to go into the details of the fact that there are those who have a stake in maintaining this to facilitate the promotion of those ideas and institutions as a consequence. So if you want to know what wisdom I tried to impart in the world, if I knew this was my last chance, I think that's it. I think you should recommit to your childhood dreams of justice. Think you were right when you got here. If you feel gaslighted, if you feel like you're not doing what you'd hoped to do, if you felt disoriented, if you felt like justice can't be achieved, that's because you entered a situation that taught you that. But you were right. And you have developed a ton of tools to use to bring to this question of really advancing justice. Skills that aren't as valuable as we would have you believe, but nonetheless are still really valuable. And you exist at an unbelievable moment in history. They happen every 50 years. A moment when the granite of the system, petrified hierarchy and injustice, is actually in flux. And it's clay. And it is changing. And it's changing rapidly. You live at one of those moments. So much more than so many graduates of Harvard Law School or any legal education system. You have the opportunity to use your justice dream, to try to pursue it, to make a difference with it. Because now really matters. And it's not enough to throw a coin to a beggar. Integration is not enough. Diversity is not enough. The house is on fire. Now. Thank you very much.